I was standing in the lobby of the bank when I saw my son sitting beside a young couple I had never met. My daughter-in-law, Karen, kept her eyes on the table, and my granddaughter, Emily, refused to look at me at all. Then
Here
I
is the
saw the
paperwork we
documents.
reviewed.
My house,
I just
my
don't know what
address,
to say. This
my
changes
name.
everything.
The banker smiled politely and slid the papers toward me. Mrs. Murphy, we just need your signature so we can finalize the sale. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The home my husband and I had built 42 years earlier had already been sold by my own family without my knowledge. I looked directly at my son. "Brian," I whispered, "when exactly did you decide I no longer belonged in my own home?" He never answered. If this story reminds you of someone you've loved, or if you've ever felt betrayed by the people you trusted most, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment and tell me how you would have reacted in my place. And if you're listening tonight from somewhere in the world, tell me where you are and what time it is there. Sometimes it helps to know we're not alone. Thank you for spending these moments with me. If you'd like to stay for the rest of my story, please consider liking and subscribing so we can continue this journey together. The house on Maplewood Drive had been my home for 42 years. When my husband David and I bought it in the spring of 1984, the paint was peeling. The roof leaked during every storm, and the kitchen cabinets barely closed. Most people would have walked away. But David stood in the middle of that tiny living room, took my hand, and said, "Helen, this is where we're going to grow old together." For a long time, I believed him. Even now, 6 years after his death, I could still hear his footsteps in the hallway some mornings. I still expected him to walk through the back door carrying groceries or complaining about the Ohio winters. At 67, I lived alone. People hear that phrase and immediately imagine loneliness. But my life was not lonely. Quiet, perhaps. Slower than before. Yet there was comfort in routines. Every morning, I woke up at 6. I made coffee in the same blue ceramic mug David had given me on our 25th anniversary. I sat beside the kitchen window and watched the neighborhood wake up. Children waited for school buses. Neighbors walked their dogs. The maple tree David planted in our front yard had grown so large that its branches shaded half the lawn. Some mornings I spoke to him. "I made your favorite coffee," I would whisper. It may sound foolish, but widows understand these things. David had been an accountant for nearly 40 years. He believed in savings accounts, paid off mortgages, and keeping every important document inside clearly labeled folders. He used to joke that even after his death, he would still be organizing my life. Sometimes I laughed at the thought. Sometimes I cried. Our son Brian had grown up inside those walls. I could still picture him running through the hallway with scraped knees and baseball gloves. He had been a sweet little boy once. Sensitive, protective. When he was 10 years old, he used to tell me, "Mom, when I grow up, I'll take care of you forever." Life changes children. Or perhaps it simply reveals who they become. Brian was 45 now and lived 20 minutes away with his wife Karen and their daughter Emily. Karen worked in real estate administration. She dressed beautifully, spoke carefully, and always seemed to know exactly what to say to people. Sometimes I admired that about her. Sometimes it made me uncomfortable. Emily was 22 and had recently graduated from college. I had helped raise her while Brian and Karen worked long hours. I attended every school play, every piano recital, every birthday party. When she was little, she used to climb into my lap and call me her best friend. The years had changed her too. Young people become busy. They build their own lives. At least, that is what I told myself. Every Sunday, my family came to dinner. I cooked because it made me happy. Pot roast, chicken and dumplings, meatloaf, apple pie. David used to say I fed people because I loved them. Perhaps that was true. One Sunday afternoon in early October, I stood in my kitchen preparing mashed potatoes while Emily sat at the table scrolling through her phone. "Grandma," she said without looking up, "have you ever thought about downsizing?" I smiled. "Why would I do that?" She shrugged. "This house is pretty big for one person." Before I could answer, Karen entered carrying a bowl of salad. "She only means that maintaining a house gets harder as we age." As we age. I noticed the words immediately. Not you, Helen. Us. As if we all belonged to some fragile category that could no longer make decisions. "I manage fine," I said gently. Brian poured himself coffee. "We worry about you, Mom." I looked at my son. "For what reason?" He hesitated. "You live alone." "I've lived alone for 6 years." Karen smiled. "We just want you to have options." Options? It seemed like such an innocent word. But something about that conversation settled heavily inside me. That night after everyone left, I walked through the house. The living room, the staircase, David's workshop in the garage, our bedroom. 42 years of memories surrounded me. This house had survived layoffs, illnesses, arguments, celebrations, and grief. It held our entire marriage inside its walls. I could not imagine leaving it. A few weeks later, Brian offered to help organize some of my paperwork. "You have so many documents, Mom. Insurance papers, tax records, bank statements. I know where everything is. You don't want something to happen and nobody can find anything. Something to happen." Again, the language bothered me. I noticed that Brian had begun asking questions. Where were the deed papers? Did I still have the mortgage documents? Who handled my finances? Did I have a will? At first, I answered casually. After all, he was my son. But slowly, I began keeping my answers shorter. One afternoon, my neighbor Margaret Ellis came over for tea. Margaret was 70 years old, widowed like me, and blessed with the ability to notice everything happening on our street. "You seem distracted," she said. I laughed. "Do I?" "A little." I stirred my tea. "Brian worries about me. Children do that. He thinks I shouldn't live alone forever." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think? I think I'm still alive?" She smiled. "That seems reasonable." We both laughed. But later, after she left, I found myself standing in David's old office. His desk remained exactly as he had left it. His reading glasses, his calculator, his framed photograph of us on our 30th anniversary. I opened one of the drawers. Inside sat dozens of neatly labeled folders. Taxes, insurance, savings, property. I remembered one conversation shortly before his death. David had been sitting beside me in the hospital room. "Helen," he had said quietly, "promise me something. Never let anyone pressure you into decisions about this house." I had squeezed his hand. Why would they? Because people change when money becomes involved. At the time, I thought he was simply worried about me being alone. Now, standing inside his office 6 years later, those words suddenly returned. People change when money becomes involved. That evening, Brian called. "Mom, Karen, and I are thinking maybe we should come over this weekend and help organize some paperwork." I looked around the quiet kitchen. The blue mug, the maple tree outside, David's empty chair. "I'm fine. Brian, you don't have to do everything yourself." "I know." There was a long silence. Finally, he said, "We only want what's best for you." After we hung up, I stood at the window for several minutes. The neighborhood had become dark. The porch light illuminated the front steps. For the first time in years, my home no longer felt entirely peaceful. Nothing had happened. No one had argued. Nobody had raised their voice. Yet something had changed. It was small, almost invisible, like the first crack in a foundation. And although I could not explain it, I suddenly felt as if my family had begun discussing my future without me. By November, the questions had become impossible to ignore. Brian called more often than he used to. For years, our conversations had been simple. He would ask how I was feeling, tell me about work, complain about traffic, or discuss Emily's classes. But now our phone calls seemed to revolve around only one subject: my finances. One Wednesday afternoon, while I was folding laundry, the telephone rang. "Hey, Mom." "Hello, Brian. How are you feeling today?" "I'm perfectly fine." "That's good." There was a short pause. Then he asked, "Have you updated your will recently?" I stopped folding one of David's old shirts that I still kept in my dresser. "My will?" "Yeah." Karen and I were talking. We just think it's important to have everything organized. "I already have a will. When was the last time you looked at it after your father passed away?" Another pause. "Well, maybe you should update it." "Why? So nobody has problems later?" "Problems later." I had begun noticing those words. Later. Someday. If something happens. When the time comes. As though my future had already been shortened into a countdown that everyone else could see. "I'll think about it," I said. Brian sounded disappointed. After we hung up, I sat alone in my kitchen. Outside, leaves covered the front lawn. The maple tree David planted had turned deep shades of orange and red. For the first time, I felt uneasy inside my own home. The following Sunday, everyone came for dinner. Karen brought a pie. Emily barely looked up from her phone. Brian seemed unusually cheerful. During dessert, Karen leaned forward. "Helen, have you ever considered putting someone's name on your accounts?" I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Well, just in case there's an emergency. I already have arrangements." Brian spoke next. "If you were in the hospital, somebody would need access." I set down my fork. "I'm not in the hospital." Emily finally looked up. "Grandma, they're only trying to help." "I know." Karen smiled. "You shouldn't see this as criticism. Then how should I see it?" The room became quiet. Brian cleared his throat. "You know, people our age have to think about these things. People our age." There it was again. Not your age. Our age. As if 67 meant I had already stepped outside the world of decisions. I stood and began collecting plates. "I think we've talked enough about my finances for one evening." Karen immediately stood. "Oh, let me help. I've washed dishes for 40 years, I said. "I think I can manage." Nobody answered. Later that evening, Emily stayed behind while Brian loaded the car. She walked into the kitchen where I was drying dishes. "Grandma." "Yes, don't be mad at Dad." "I'm not mad. He worries about you." I turned toward her. "Do you?" She hesitated. "You live alone." "I've lived alone for 6 years." She lowered her eyes. "People our age think differently." That sentence hurt more than she realized. People our age. At 22, she had quietly placed me into a different category. Old, fragile, temporary. I reached for her hand. "Emily, do you think I can't take care of myself?" She looked uncomfortable. "No, not exactly." "Then what exactly?" She did not answer. A few minutes later, she hugged me goodbye, but the hug felt different, polite, careful, as though she were comforting someone who had already become weak. The next week, Karen offered to help organize my paperwork. She arrived carrying a leather notebook and several folders. "I made a checklist," she said, "a checklist for important documents." She sat at my dining room table. Insurance. I handed her the insurance folder. Property taxes. I pointed to the file cabinet. Bank information. I looked at her. Why? So we know where things are. Karen smiled. The family. Something inside me became cautious. David used to say that people often revealed themselves through small words. We, ours. Eventually. I watched Karen write notes. She asked where I kept the deed. She asked which bank held my accounts. She asked whether the house still had a mortgage. No, I said. When was it paid off? Years ago. How much is the property worth now? I folded my arms. Karen, why are you asking? She looked surprised. Oh, I'm only helping. With what? She laughed softly. You really are independent. I've had practice. She left shortly afterward, but before leaving, she said something that stayed with me. You know houses in your neighborhood are selling very quickly. I forced a smile. That's nice. You could make a lot of money. I'm not selling, she quickly answered. I know. I'm just saying. After she left, I stood in my living room for several minutes. Nobody had directly asked me to sell my home. Nobody had demanded anything. Yet every conversation seemed to circle back to the same place. Money, property, the future. One Friday afternoon, Margaret Ellis knocked on my door. She carried 2 cups of coffee. Walk with me. We walked slowly through the neighborhood. After several minutes, she said, Something's bothering you. I sighed. Am I that obvious? Yes. I told her about the conversations, the questions, the documents, the concern. Margaret listened quietly. Finally, she asked, Do you trust them? The question surprised me. Of course. Completely. I did not answer, because the truth had become complicated. I loved my family. I had sacrificed for them. I had babysat Emily for years. I had loaned Brian money when he struggled after losing his first job. I had helped Karen after her mother died. Family was what you did. You showed up, you gave, you forgave. But trust is different from love. Margaret stopped walking. Helen, there's nothing wrong with protecting yourself. They're my family. So is my brother. I looked at her. She rarely discussed her own life. When my husband died, she said quietly, my brother wanted me to sell my house and move into assisted living. What happened? He wanted the money. The cold wind moved through the trees. She looked directly at me. Sometimes people convince themselves they're helping when they're really helping themselves. That night, I could not sleep. Around midnight, I walked into David's office. Moonlight came through the window. I opened his desk drawer. Inside sat the familiar folders. Property. Insurance. Legal. I picked up the property file. Attached to the front was one of David's handwritten labels. Home. Underneath, in smaller letters, he had written, For Helen. Only Helen. I stared at those words. For Helen. Only Helen. A strange feeling moved through me. Not fear. Not yet. But something close to it. The next morning, Brian called again. Mom, Karen, and I want to bring some papers by next weekend. What kind of papers? Just information. What information? There was silence. Finally, he said, Things you should probably sign someday. I looked around my kitchen. David's coffee mug. The family photographs. 42 years of memories. And suddenly, I heard my husband's voice again. Never let anyone pressure you. I spoke very carefully. I don't sign anything I haven't read. Brian laughed. Mom, you make it sound like we're trying to trick you. No, I said softly, but lately, I'm beginning to wonder why everyone seems so interested in my house. The line became completely silent. and for the first time in my life, my own son did not know what to say. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Brian called just after dinner. Mom, we're having everyone over Saturday night. Everyone, just us. Karen wants to cook. I nearly laughed. In 20 years of marriage, Karen had never once insisted on cooking dinner for me. She was polite, organized, and efficient, but she did not enjoy kitchens. She often joked that restaurants existed for a reason. Is it a special occasion? I asked. No, Brian answered quickly. We just thought it would be nice. After we hung up, I sat quietly in my living room. Outside, the November wind rattled the branches of the maple tree. Nothing about the invitation felt normal. On Saturday evening, I drove to Brian's house. The moment Karen opened the front door, I noticed something strange. Candles, music, the dining room table fully decorated. Emily actually came to hug me. You look beautiful, Grandma. Karen took my coat. Brian poured me a glass of wine. For several minutes, I almost convinced myself that I had imagined everything. Maybe Margaret had been wrong. Maybe I had become too suspicious. Maybe my family truly was trying to be kind. Dinner was wonderful. Karen made roast chicken. Emily talked about job applications. Brian discussed football. For nearly an hour, nobody mentioned my house. Nobody mentioned paperwork. Nobody mentioned my future. And then dessert arrived. Karen placed a cheesecake on the table. Brian cleared his throat. There's actually something we wanted to discuss. The warmth immediately disappeared from the room. I looked at him. What is it? Karen reached beside her chair and lifted a brown folder. My stomach tightened. Oh, nothing serious, she said quickly. Brian smiled. We've been talking to a financial planner. A financial planner? He helps families organize assets. I folded my hands in my lap. What does that have to do with me? Karen opened the folder. We thought it might be smart to simplify things. Simplify what your estate. I looked from one face to another. Emily avoided my eyes. Brian slid several papers across the table. These are just precautionary documents. I did not touch them. What kind of documents? Karen answered. Power of attorney, emergency authorization, things like that. I felt my heartbeat increase. I already have legal documents. These are updated. Who updated them? Brian leaned forward. Mom, we're only trying to help. I picked up the first page. Most of it was covered by a yellow sticky note. Only the signature line remained visible. Why is this covered? Karen immediately removed the note. Oh, that was an accident. I lowered my eyes. The page title had been folded backward. I carefully unfolded it. Property Transfer Authorization. My heart stopped. What is this? Brian spoke quickly. It's part of the package. What package? The financial package. I read further. Certain sections had been highlighted. Others had been covered. The language was complicated. Legal. Technical. Confusing. I looked directly at my son. Brian, what exactly are you asking me to sign? Karen answered before he could. These papers simply make things easier. For whom? Legal. Technical. Confusing. I looked directly at my son. Brian, what exactly are you asking me to sign? Karen answered before he could. These papers simply make things easier. For whom? For everyone. I set the papers down. No. The room became silent. Brian blinked. What do you mean, I mean no? You haven't read them. Exactly. Karen forced a smile. We can explain them. Then explain why property documents are included. Brian sighed. Mom, if something happened, nothing has happened. If you became sick, I'm not sick. If you needed assistance, I haven't asked for assistance. Emily finally spoke. Grandma, please don't make this difficult. I turned toward her. Difficult. She looked uncomfortable. We're trying to protect you from what nobody answered. I stood from the table. I think I should go home. Brian stood immediately. Mom, don't overreact. I'm not overreacting. Karen followed me into the kitchen. Helen, you know we love you. Then why are there property documents on your dining room table? They don't mean anything. Then why do they require my signature? Karen followed me into the kitchen. Helen, you know we love you. Then why are there property documents on your dining room table? They don't mean anything. Then why do they require my signature? Karen crossed her arms. You don't trust us. The words hurt, because trust had never been the issue before. For 45 years, I had trusted my son with everything. I trusted him when he borrowed money. I trusted him when he lost jobs. I trusted him with my granddaughter. I trusted him after David died, and now suddenly I felt like a stranger sitting at his table. Brian entered the kitchen. Mom, these papers are routine. Then take them to your own mother. His face changed. You are my mother. Then stop treating me like a legal problem. The silence that followed seemed endless. Finally, Emily spoke quietly. You don't understand. I looked at her. Then help me understand. She swallowed. You can't stay alone forever. There it was. Not concern, not paperwork, not financial planning. The real issue, my future. Or rather, the future they had already imagined for me. I took my coat. Karen suddenly said something that froze me. You have to think realistically. I turned around. What does that mean? She hesitated. At your age, at your age, at your age. I looked around the room. My son, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter. 3 people I loved. 3 people looking at me as if I were already disappearing. I am 67 years old, I said quietly. Not 97. Nobody spoke. I drive myself. I pay my bills. I maintain my house. I cook. I clean. I take care of myself. Brian rubbed his forehead. Nobody said otherwise. Then why am I sitting here signing papers I don't understand? He finally lost patience. Because we're trying to prevent problems. What problems? Future problems. I nodded slowly. I see. The truth was beginning to emerge. Not completely, but enough. Something larger existed beneath these conversations. Something they were not saying. As I walked toward the front door, Karen spoke softly. Please just take the papers home. I looked down at the folder. No, at least read them. I will read anything my own attorney gives me. Brian looked shocked. Attorney? Yes. Mom, why would you need an attorney? I looked directly into his eyes. Because lately, everyone seems very interested in my house. No one answered. The drive home felt longer than usual. Rain had started falling. The streets were empty. When I entered my house, I locked the door behind me. I stood in the dark living room. The grandfather clock ticked quietly. David's photograph sat on the bookshelf. I walked into his office. For several minutes, I simply sat at his desk. Then I remembered the folded paper. During dinner, while reviewing the documents, I had noticed one page partly hidden beneath another. Without thinking, I had slipped it into my purse. I opened my handbag, removed the page, and unfolded it. Most of the document made little sense. Legal terms, property references, transfer language. But one line caught my attention. Owner occupancy status, my address, my house. And underneath, faintly visible through the paper, as though copied from another page, proposed sale. My hands began shaking. Sale. Not transfer. Not protection. Sale. I stared at the word. Outside, rain struck the windows. Inside the quiet office, I suddenly realized something that made my blood run cold. My family had not been asking about my home. They had been planning something involving it, and for the first time since David died, I no longer felt safe inside the life I had built. I hardly slept that night. The paper I had taken from Brian's dining room table lay beside David's old desk lamp. I must have read the same lines 20 times. Most of the document meant nothing to me. There were references to property transfers, ownership, verification, market value estimates, and other legal terms that only made my headache worse. But one phrase continued to haunt me. Proposed sale. Not potential sale. Not future consideration. Proposed sale. As if someone had already begun discussing my house with other people. At 7 the next morning, I called Brian. He answered immediately. Mom, I have a question. Okay, the papers from last night. Silence. What about them? I saw a reference to a proposed sale. Several seconds passed. Finally, he laughed. Oh, that. Yes, that. It's nothing. What does nothing mean? It was just an example form. An example for what real estate planning. I closed my eyes. Brian, are you trying to sell my house? His voice became defensive. Of course not. It was just an example form. An example for what real estate planning. I closed my eyes. Brian, are you trying to sell my house? His voice became defensive. Of course not. Then why does a document mention a sale? Mom, you're overthinking this. I hated those words. Overthinking. Women hear them all their lives. When we notice something, when we ask questions, when we refuse to ignore our instincts. I'm not overthinking, I said quietly. I'm reading, he sighed heavily. I have to get to work. And then he ended the call. That had never happened before. For years, my son had always been patient with me. Now, he sounded irritated, almost angry. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning the house. Cleaning had always been my way of calming myself. I dusted shelves, washed windows, organized kitchen drawers. Yet my thoughts continued returning to the papers. Around noon, my doorbell rang. Margaret Ellis stood outside, wearing her long winter coat. I brought soup, she said. You always know when I need soup. She smiled. You look terrible. Thank you. We sat in the kitchen drinking tea. After several minutes, I finally showed her the paper. Margaret adjusted her glasses. She read quietly. Her expression changed. Helen. What, who gave you this? It was mixed with some papers Brian wanted me to sign. She read it again. This looks like real estate paperwork. My stomach tightened. You think so? I'm not an attorney, but it certainly looks that way. I stared at the table. Margaret spoke carefully. Have you noticed anything unusual around your house? I frowned. What do you mean, cars, visitors, people taking pictures? No. She hesitated. Are you sure? My heart skipped. Why Margaret looked uncomfortable. About 2 weeks ago, I saw a man taking photographs outside your house. I felt suddenly cold. What kind of man? He looked like a realtor. Why didn't you tell me? I thought perhaps you knew. I could barely speak. He took pictures. Yes. Of my house. She nodded. I stood up. No. Helen. No one asked permission. Margaret looked genuinely concerned. He had a clipboard. When Tuesday morning? I sat down again. Tuesday. The same week, Karen had asked questions about the value of my home. My hands began shaking. Margaret reached for my arm. Helen, perhaps there's an explanation, but there were becoming fewer explanations. That afternoon, I walked slowly around my property. The front porch, the side yard, the garage, the backyard garden. Everything looked the same. Yet suddenly, I viewed my home differently, as if someone else had already been examining it, measuring it, pricing it, selling it. I entered the garage. David's old workbench remained exactly as he had left it. His tools hung neatly on the wall. His fishing equipment still sat in the corner. 42 years of our lives lived inside these rooms. Could Brian truly be considering selling it? No. My heart refused to believe it. My son had flaws. Everyone does. He worried about money. He sometimes made poor decisions. But he was not dishonest. At least, that is what I wanted to believe. 2 days later, another strange thing happened. I opened my mailbox and immediately noticed several missing envelopes. I always kept my mail neatly arranged. Property tax notices, insurance information, bank statements. But something seemed different. Certain envelopes had already been opened. I stood in my kitchen studying them. One envelope from the county assessor's office had clearly been resealed. I knew because I always opened mail carefully with a letter opener. This one had been torn. My heart began racing. Had someone entered my house? No. Only family members had keys. Family. I picked up my telephone. Karen answered. Hello, Helen. Were you in my house last? Hello, Helen. Were you in my house last week? She sounded surprised. What? My mail has been opened. No. Did Brian stop by? No. Does Emily still have her old key? I don't think so. I listened carefully. Corinne suddenly asked, what kind of mail week? She sounded surprised. What? My mail has been opened. No. Did Brian stop by? No. Does Emily still have her old key? I don't think so. I listened carefully. Karen suddenly asked, what kind of mail? The question bothered me. Why I was just asking. County mail. There was a pause. Oh, why are you saying, oh, no reason? I felt something tighten inside my chest. Karen changed the subject immediately. How are you feeling today? I was asking about the mail. Maybe the post office damaged it? Perhaps, but perhaps not. That Friday, I went grocery shopping. As I loaded bags into my car, one of my neighbors approached me. Mrs. Donnelly lived 3 houses away. Helen, hello, Carol. She smiled. I heard you were moving. I nearly dropped a bag. Moving? Yes? Who told you that? She looked confused. I thought everyone knew. Knew what that you were selling your house. For several seconds, I could not speak. I am not selling my house. Her smile disappeared. Oh, who told you that? She hesitated. I saw a real estate sign. I felt dizzy. A sign. It was only there one day. What kind of sign? Coming soon. I gripped the shopping cart. Where? In your yard. My knees nearly gave way. My yard? Yes. But it disappeared. When last week? I drove home in complete silence. The neighborhood passed in a blur. When I reached my driveway, I sat inside the car for nearly 10 minutes. A sign. Someone had placed a sign. Someone had taken photographs. People believed my house was for sale, and I knew absolutely nothing. Inside the house, I found myself standing in the center of the living room. The same room where Brian had opened Christmas presents. The same room where David had proposed to me again on our 30th anniversary. The same room where I sat beside my husband during hospice care. Who would put a sign in my yard? Only someone who believed they had the right. That evening, Brian called. "Hey, Mom." His voice sounded cheerful. I could barely answer. "Hello? You okay? Did you put a real estate sign in my yard?" Silence. Long silence. Finally, he said, "Who told you that?" My heart sank. No. Not absolutely not. Who told you? Was there a sign? It wasn't what you think. I gripped the phone tightly. What exactly do I think? It was temporary. Why? We were just looking at possibilities. For whom? For you. I did not ask you to. You never think about the future. The future belongs to me. He became frustrated. "Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be." Those words struck me deeply. Harder. As though my cooperation had already been expected. As though the decision had already been made. I want my house left alone. Nobody is doing anything. Then why was there a sign? No answer. I could hear him breathing. Finally, he said quietly, "We only want what's best for you." I looked around my empty living room, at David's chair, at our wedding photograph, at 42 years of memories, and for the first time, a terrible thought entered my mind. Perhaps my family had already begun making plans for my life, without asking me, without telling me. And perhaps they believed I would simply accept whatever they decided. But as I stood there in the quiet house David had built with his own hands, I realized something equally important. If someone truly was trying to take my home, they were going to discover that Helen Murphy was not nearly as weak as they believed. After the conversation about the real estate sign, something changed between Brian and me. For several days, he did not call. Karen did not text. Emily remained silent. The quiet should have brought relief, but instead, it made me anxious. It felt as though everyone had stepped backward, regrouping somewhere beyond my sight. December arrived early that year. The first snow covered the neighborhood overnight, turning Maplewood Drive into a picture postcard. David had always loved the first snowfall. He used to stand by the front window with a cup of coffee and say that snow made every house look honest. I wondered what he would say now. Perhaps houses remained honest. Perhaps people did not. One Thursday afternoon, Brian arrived unexpectedly. I was decorating the living room for Christmas when I heard his truck. He entered carrying groceries. "Thought you might need some help." His voice sounded normal, almost too normal. "Thank you." He carried the bags into the kitchen. For several minutes, we talked about ordinary things. The weather, Christmas shopping, Emily's job search. For a brief moment, I felt hopeful. Maybe we could return to being mother and son. Maybe all of this had been one terrible misunderstanding. Then Brian sat down at the kitchen table. "Helen." He had not called me Helen since he was 16 years old. My stomach tightened. "What is it?" He folded his hands. "I want you to listen before you get upset." I said nothing. "You can't live here forever." The words landed like ice water. I stared at him. "This is my house. I know. I paid for this house. I know. Your father and I built our lives here. He sighed. You're missing the point. What point? Missing the point. What point? We hour 67. There it was again. Not mother. Not Helen. An age. A number. As if my birthday had somehow reduced my authority. I know how old I am. You live alone. R67. There it was again. Not mother. Not Helen. An age. A number. As if my birthday had somehow reduced my authority. I know how old I am. You live alone. Yes. What if you fall? I haven't. What if you get sick? I'm not. What if something happens? I stood slowly. Brian, something happens to everyone. He looked frustrated. You're making this emotional. I laughed softly. My home is emotional. He shook his head. You need to think practically. Practical. Another word I had begun to hate. Practical apparently meant giving up. Practical meant letting younger people decide. Practical meant preparing for a future that had not arrived. I sat back down. What exactly do you want? He hesitated. Finally, he said, There are senior communities. I'm not interested. There are beautiful apartments. I'm not moving. You could be closer to us. You live 20 minutes away. He looked down. It would free up money. There it was. The truth had finally entered the room. Money. Not safety. Not concern. Money. For whom? For everyone. I felt my chest tighten. For everyone. You know, Emily has student loans. I said nothing. Karen's business hasn't been doing well. Still nothing. I've had some financial problems. The room became silent. What kind of problems? He rubbed his forehead. Debt? How much? A lot. I suddenly understood. Not everything, but enough. The questions, the paperwork, the property value, the real estate sign, the proposed sale. Debt. Brian. I didn't want to tell you. How long? Almost 2 years. I leaned back in my chair. My son was drowning financially. Part of me wanted to embrace him. Part of me wanted to help. Because mothers never stop being mothers. But another part of me realized something terrifying. They had decided my house was the solution. Without asking me. Without my permission. Did Karen know? Yes. Emily. He hesitated. Yes. The answer hurt the most. Emily, the little girl who used to bake cookies with me, the child who slept in my guest room, the granddaughter who once said she wanted to grow old beside me. She knew. I suddenly felt very tired. Brian continued speaking. We thought if you sold the house, Karen and I, you already had a plan. No. Yes, you did. He became defensive. We were trying to protect everyone by selling my home, by helping all of us. All of us. I looked around my kitchen. David's coffee mug sat beside the sink. His favorite clock still hung on the wall. 42 years of our life surrounded me. Did you already tell people no? I looked directly at him. Brian, he lowered his eyes. Some people. How many I don't know. My voice became very quiet. Did you tell people I agreed? Silence. He did not answer, and his silence gave me the truth. My own son had already spoken for me. He had already decided. He had already told others. At that moment, the front door opened. Karen entered carrying shopping bags. She immediately sensed the tension. What happened? Brian spoke first. We're talking. Karen sat down. Helen, we all need to be honest. I looked at her. Yes. She took a deep breath. This house is worth almost $600,000. The number felt ugly, cold. She continued, "You don't need all this space. This is my home. You could live comfortably somewhere smaller." "I choose not to." She folded her arms. "Sometimes people have to make difficult decisions." I could not believe what I was hearing. What people? She met my eyes. Families. For the first time in 20 years, anger rose inside me. "My husband and I bought this house. I understand. We paid every mortgage payment. I know. We sacrificed vacations. We worked overtime. We built this life." For the first time in 20 years, anger rose inside me. "My husband and I bought this house. I understand. We paid every mortgage payment. I know. We sacrificed vacations. We worked overtime. We built this life." Karen said something I will never forget. "You're thinking emotionally." I stood. "And you're thinking financially." Nobody spoke. At that exact moment, Emily walked into the kitchen. She stopped when she saw us. "What happened?" I turned toward her. "Did you know?" She looked at her parents, then back at me. "Grandma, did you know they wanted to sell my house?" Her eyes filled with tears. We were worried. I felt my heart breaking. Not because she answered, because she never said no. I sat down again. The room suddenly felt smaller. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Finally, Emily whispered, "You don't need such a big house." Those words hurt more than everything else, because they came from the child I had helped raise. The little girl who once built blanket forts in my living room. The granddaughter who learned to ride a bicycle in my driveway. I looked at her. "Who told you that?" She began crying. "Dad." Brian closed his eyes. Karen looked away. And in that moment, I understood something devastating. This was no longer simply an idea. This had become a family conversation, a family plan, one that had been discussed behind my back, one that included everyone except me. I walked slowly toward the front door. Brian followed. "Mom?" I turned. "No." "What, you don't get to decide when I'm finished living here?" His face fell. "We're only trying to help." I opened the door. "Then help me stay in my own home." Outside, snow had begun falling again. The cold air struck my face. Behind me, nobody spoke. As I walked to my car, I heard Karen quietly say, "She isn't being realistic." I stopped. Without turning around, I answered, "No, I'm simply refusing to disappear because it would make everyone else's life easier." And for the first time, I realized that my family no longer saw me as Helen Murphy. They saw me as an obstacle, an old woman standing between them and something they wanted. The call came on a Monday morning. At first, I almost ignored it. The number on my phone was unfamiliar, and ever since Christmas advertisements had begun filling my mailbox, I had grown tired of answering calls from strangers. But something made me pick up. "Hello? Good morning. May I speak with Mrs. Helen Murphy?" "This is Helen. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm calling from First National Bank regarding your appointment this Thursday." I frowned. "My appointment?" "Yes, ma'am. We wanted to confirm that 10 o'clock still works for you." I sat down at the kitchen table. "I believe you have the wrong person." There was a brief pause. "Mrs. Helen Murphy of 147 Maplewood Drive." My heart skipped. "Yes, wonderful. We simply need to confirm the final paperwork meeting regarding the property transaction." I gripped the edge of the table. What property transaction? Another silence. The banker suddenly sounded uncertain. The property sale, madam. For several seconds I could not speak. My house. The words seemed impossible. What sale? Mrs. Murphy, I apologize. I was under the impression everyone had already been informed. I looked at David's empty chair. I haven't been informed of anything. His voice became cautious. Perhaps I should ask you to contact your family. My family. Yes, ma'am. I could hear papers moving. The closing meet-and-G is scheduled for Thursday morning. I haven't been informed of anything. His voice became cautious. Perhaps I should ask you to contact your family. My family. Yes, ma'am. I could hear papers moving. The closing meeting is scheduled for Thursday morning. Closing. The word echoed inside my head. Closing meant buyers. Closing meant contracts. Closing meant someone believed my home had already been sold. When was this scheduled? Several weeks ago. My breathing became shallow. Several weeks, yes, ma'am. And who arranged it? There was another pause. I'm afraid I cannot discuss client information over the phone. Client. Who exactly was the client? Because it certainly was not me. Thank you, I said quietly. When the call ended, I remained motionless. The kitchen suddenly felt cold. Outside, snow covered the yard. Inside, 42 years of memories surrounded me. And somewhere beyond my knowledge, people were arranging the sale of my home. I walked into David's office. My hands trembled as I opened the property folder. Deed, insurance, tax records. Everything remained exactly where David had left it. The house belonged to me, completely. There was no mortgage, no co-owner, no transfer, no authority given to Brian, no authority given to Karen. How could anyone possibly be selling my house? For the first time in weeks, fear turned into something else. Determination. I called Margaret. She arrived 20 minutes later. The moment she entered, she knew something was wrong. What happened? I told her everything. The bank, the appointment, the closing, the sale. Margaret sat silently. When I finished, she asked one question. Are you going to the bank? She nodded. Yes. Good. I looked at her. You don't think I'm overreacting? Helen, somebody is selling your house? The words sounded unbelievable, but they were true. Somebody, not a stranger, not a criminal, my own family. That afternoon, Brian called. For a moment, I considered ignoring him. Instead, I answered normally. Hello. Hi, Mom. His voice sounded cheerful. How are you? Fine. We're thinking about coming by this weekend. Why, to talk. About what? He hesitated. Things. What things? Another pause. Family things. I stared out the kitchen window. The maple tree stood covered in snow. Brian, are you selling my house? Silence. Long silence. Finally. Who told you that? My heart sank. Again, not denial, not outrage, only fear about who had spoken. The bank called. He stopped breathing for a second. The bank? Yes. When? This morning. Another long silence. Then, Mom, you don't understand. No, Brian, I don't. We were going to tell you. When soon. How soon? He said nothing. I stood up. When exactly were you planning to tell me that my house was being sold? We thought it would be easier. Easier for whom? For everyone. Those words again. Everyone. Except me. I lowered my voice. Did you sign something? No. Did Karen? We thought it would be easier. Easier for whom? For everyone. Those words again. Everyone. Except me. I lowered my voice. Did you sign something? No. Did Karen? No. Then who? We haven't done anything illegal. Illegal. I had not used that word. He had. That frightened me more than anything. Brian. Yes. Is my house under contract? His breathing became heavy. I can explain. Answer me. Another silence. Yes. The room disappeared around me. Yes, my house, my address, my memories. Under contract. Without me. Without my permission. Without my knowledge. How we thought no. Mom, how we were trying to help. You signed papers, my house, my address, my memories. Under contract. Without me. Without my permission. Without my knowledge. How we thought no. Mom, how we were trying to help. You signed papers? No. Karen? No. Then what? He sounded exhausted. We thought if everything was ready, you would agree. I closed my eyes. The entire plan suddenly became visible. The paperwork, the real estate sign, the photographs, the questions, the pressure. They had already built the future. All they needed was me, my signature, the final piece, Helen. I realized he had used my name again. Not Mom. Helen, as if he had already stepped outside our relationship. I'm going to the bank. No. Yes, you don't need to. I absolutely do. Karen's voice suddenly appeared in the background. What did she say? Brian whispered something. Karen took the phone. Helen, please don't make this harder. Harder. Again. As though my cooperation was expected. Karen, did you arrange this? We only wanted security. My security. Our future. There it was. Not concern. Not love. Their future. And my house. Thursday, I said quietly. What? The appointment is Thursday. She said nothing. Because now she knew. I knew. Everyone knew. The secret was over. That night, I could not sleep. I walked through every room, the living room where David had proposed to me again on our 30th anniversary, the dining room where Brian celebrated his graduation, Emily's old bedroom, the kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals. I touched the walls, the photographs, the furniture. Could people really become so desperate? Could love become so tangled with money? At 2:00 in the morning, I sat in David's office. I opened his desk drawer. Inside lay his fountain pen, the same pen he used to sign our mortgage papers. I remembered him saying, "Never sign anything under pressure." I held the pen in my hands. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, I finally made my decision. I would go to the bank. I would sit in that room. I would look every person in the eye, and I would learn exactly how far my family had gone. Because if they truly believed they could sell my home behind my back, they were about to discover something they had completely forgotten. Helen Murphy was still the legal owner, and without her signature, nothing in this world belonged to anyone else. Thursday morning arrived colder than any other day that winter. I woke before dawn. For several minutes, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old furnace hum through the house. The silence felt different now. Every room seemed to be waiting. I made coffee. I used David's blue mug. I sat at the kitchen table and watched snow fall outside the window. 42 years. 42 years inside this house. and in less than 3 hours, I would walk into a bank and discover exactly how far my family had gone. I opened David's desk drawer one last time. Inside lay his fountain pen. Without thinking, I slipped it into my purse. It felt foolish, but somehow, having his pen with me felt like taking him along. At 9 o'clock, Margaret knocked on my door. "I'm driving," she said. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." During the drive, neither of us spoke very much. The streets were covered with old snow. Christmas decorations still hung from porches. People carried shopping bags. Life continued normally for everyone else. But my life felt as if it had reached the edge of something dangerous. Margaret finally spoke. "Whatever happens, remember one thing. What you own, that house." I nodded, yet my hands continued shaking. The bank stood downtown in a large brick building. First National Bank. I had passed it hundreds of times. Today, it felt unfamiliar. Margaret squeezed my hand. "You don't owe anyone an apology." I walked inside alone. The lobby was quiet. Holiday music played softly. A Christmas tree stood beside the entrance. For a brief moment, I wondered if I should turn around. Perhaps I did not want to know. Perhaps ignorance would hurt less. Then I saw Brian. He was sitting near a conference room. Beside him sat Karen. Emily occupied a chair near the wall. And across from them sat a man and woman I had never seen before. The woman was smiling. The man held a folder. My house, my family, strangers. Everything suddenly became real. Brian looked up. The color disappeared from his face. "Mom!" Karen froze. Emily lowered her eyes. Nobody moved. I walked toward them slowly. "Good morning." Brian stood. "What are you doing here?" I almost laughed. "What am I doing here?" Karen stepped forward. "Helen, we can explain." "Wonderful," I said. "Please do." The couple across the room looked confused. The woman finally spoke. "Mrs. Murphy?" I looked at her. "Yes." She smiled nervously. "We're the Hendersons." I said nothing. Her husband added, "We're buying your house." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not selling, not considering. Buying. Real people, real buyers. People who believed my home already belonged to them. Before anyone could speak again, a man emerged from the conference room. He wore glasses and carried several folders. "Mrs. Murphy?" I recognized his voice immediately. "Daniel Carter, the banker." For one brief second, he smiled politely. Then he saw my expression. He looked at Brian, then at Karen. The room suddenly became very quiet. "Mrs. Murphy," he said carefully, "please come inside." Everyone entered the conference room. The Hendersons sat together. Brian and Karen sat opposite them. Emily remained near the door. I took the chair closest to Daniel. The paperwork covered half the table. My address appeared on nearly every page. 147 Maplewood Drive, my home. Daniel opened a folder. His professional smile returned. "We only need one final signature." He turned toward me. "Mrs. Murphy, if you'll sign here, we can complete the closing." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I looked down. The signature line contained my printed name. Helen Murphy, owner, seller. I slowly lifted my eyes. I am not selling my house. The room became completely silent. The Hendersons looked confused. Daniel blinked. Brian closed his eyes. Karen whispered, "Helen." I raised my hand. "No." Daniel looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Murphy, I never agreed to sell my home. The Hendersons stared at one another. The woman spoke first. What do you mean? I looked directly at her. I mean, this is the first time I have seen any of you. Her husband frowned. But your son told us my son is not the owner. Brian stood. Mom, please. I turned toward him. No, you speak after me. His face became red. Daniel carefully closed one folder. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. I looked at him. Did anyone tell you I had approved this sale? He looked at Brian. Then Karen. Neither answered. The banker suddenly became much more serious. Mrs. Murphy, were you aware this property had been placed under contract? No. Were you aware of today's closing? No. Have you signed any sale agreement? No. The Hendersons looked shocked. Karen immediately spoke. She knew we were discussing options. I looked directly at her. Did I agree to sell my house? Karen remained silent. Brian finally exploded. Mom, you're embarrassing everyone. I stared at my son. Embarrassing everyone? The room fell silent again. You sold my house. We were trying to help. You showed strangers my home. They made an offer. You accepted it. We needed time. I could hear my own heartbeat. Daniel slowly removed his glasses. Mr. Murphy. Brian turned. Did your mother authorize this transaction? Brian hesitated. That hesitation lasted only 2 seconds. But it changed everything. Daniel looked back at me. Mrs. Murphy, I need to ask you directly. Yes. Did your mother authorize this transaction? Brian hesitated. That hesitation lasted only 2 seconds. But it changed everything. Daniel looked back at me. Mrs. Murphy, I need to ask you directly. Yes. Are you willing to proceed with this sale? The answer came easily. No. The words seemed to echo through the room. No. 42 years. My marriage. My memories. My home. No. The Hendersons looked devastated. The wife spoke softly. We already sold our house. My heart broke for them, because they were victims too. I looked at them. I am truly sorry. The husband asked, You really didn't know? No. Daniel closed the folder. No. Daniel closed the folder. His voice became formal. Without Mrs. Murphy's approval and signature, this transaction cannot proceed. Brian stood up. Daniel, wait. No. Karen leaned forward. There has to be another solution. There is not. His voice became formal. Without Mrs. Murphy's approval and signature, this transaction cannot proceed. Brian stood up. Daniel, wait. No. Karen leaned forward. There has to be another solution. There is not. Brian looked at me. You can't do this. I almost could not believe what I was hearing. I can't do this. You know our situation. And you knew mine. His voice cracked. We need this. I felt tears filling my eyes. Not because of the money, because my son had finally said the truth. Not we want. Not we're concerned. Not we're helping. We need this. My house. Their solution. Emily suddenly began crying. Please stop. Nobody moved. She looked at me. Grandma, we didn't know what else to do. I turned toward her. You ask. The room became silent. You ask me? Nobody answered. Daniel gathered the documents. The Hendersons sat quietly. Brian looked defeated. Karen looked frightened. And for the first time in months, I finally understood exactly what had happened. My family had never expected me to refuse. They had built an entire future around one assumption, that Helen Murphy would sign. But they had forgotten one very important fact. The house belonged to me. And as Daniel Carter quietly carried away the closing papers, my family finally realized that the one signature they needed was the only signature they never truly had. For several seconds after Daniel Carter closed the folder, nobody moved. The conference room had become strangely quiet. Outside the glass walls, bank employees continued working, answering phones, greeting customers, and discussing loans as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside that room, an entire family had collapsed. Brian remained standing. Karen stared at the table. Emily cried quietly. The Hendersons sat frozen in disbelief, and I sat there looking at my own son, trying to understand how we had reached this moment. Daniel finally spoke. "I believe we should end today's meeting." Brian turned toward him. "You can't just cancel everything." Daniel's expression remained calm. "Mr. Murphy, your mother has clearly stated that she does not consent to the sale. We've already signed documents. That does not transfer ownership." Karen leaned forward. "We've invested money." Daniel folded his hands. "Without the owner's signature, there is no transaction." The Hendersons exchanged nervous glances. The wife finally spoke. "Brian, you told us your mother had already agreed." Brian looked exhausted. She was going to. I could hardly believe those words. She was going to. As if my agreement no longer mattered. As if my future had already been decided. I stood slowly. No, Brian. I wasn't. He looked at me with frustration. "You don't understand our situation. Then explain it." The room became silent. For the first time, I saw something in my son's face that I had never seen before. Fear. Real fear. He sat down heavily. "I owe money." "How much?" He looked toward Karen. Neither answered. I spoke again. "How much?" Karen finally whispered. "About $200,000. Even Daniel looked surprised. The Hendersons stared openly. Emily covered her face. I felt the air leave my lungs. $200,000. How Brian rubbed his eyes. "Investments." "What investments?" "A business opportunity." Karen quickly added, "It wasn't supposed to fail." "What business?" Brian's voice cracked. "Commercial property." Suddenly, pieces began fitting together. Karen worked in real estate. Brian had money problems. My house had value. The property had become the solution. Not because I wanted to sell, because they needed me to. I looked directly at Karen. "When did this start?" She looked away. "A year ago. A year. For one entire year they had known. One entire year while sitting at my dinner table. One entire year while I baked birthday cakes. One entire year while they asked questions about my finances. A year." Emily knew. My granddaughter slowly nodded. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I didn't know what to do. I looked at her. How long? Several months. The pain of her answer felt different. Brian's betrayal hurt. Karen's deception angered me. But Emily's silence broke my heart. Because she had always been my safe place. My little girl. The child who once promised she would never leave me. I turned toward the Hendersons. "I am so sorry." Mrs. Henderson wiped her eyes. "We sold our home last month." Her husband spoke quietly. "We thought everything was finished." Daniel cleared his throat. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, the bank will work with you regarding your options. But their disappointment filled the room, because they had trusted Brian too. We had all trusted him. Daniel gathered several documents. As he reviewed them, his expression slowly changed. He looked toward Brian. Mr. Murphy, I have a question. Brian looked up. Did your mother attend the initial consultation? No. Did she sign the preliminary disclosures? No. Did she authorize anyone to act on her behalf? Brian said nothing. Daniel looked at Karen. Mrs. Murphy. Karen swallowed. We assumed... No. Daniel interrupted gently. Did she authorize anyone? Karen lowered her eyes. No. For the first time that morning, I saw concern appear on the banker's face. He carefully separated several papers. These signatures. Brian looked nervous. What about them? Some documents appear to contain acknowledgments on behalf of Mrs. Murphy. My heart began racing. What does that mean? Daniel looked at me. Mrs. Murphy, did you sign any preliminary disclosure forms? No. He turned the pages toward me. There beside my printed name appeared a signature. Helen Murphy. But it wasn't mine. I felt cold. Who signed that? Nobody answered. Brian looked down. Karen remained silent. Daniel spoke carefully. This isn't the final sale agreement. However, these acknowledgments indicate the owner received certain notices. I stared at the signature. Someone had written my name. Not perfectly, not exactly, but enough to pretend. Brian. His eyes filled with tears. We didn't think. You signed my name. No. Who did? Karen suddenly spoke. It wasn't meant to hurt you. I looked at her. Who signed my name? Silence. Emily began crying harder. Daniel quietly closed the file. I think this conversation should continue with legal advice. The word legal hung heavily in the room. Because suddenly, this was no longer a family disagreement. Documents existed, signatures existed, statements had been made, promises had been given, and my name had appeared where it did not belong. Brian stood up. Mom, please. I looked at him. No. We were desperate. You lied. We needed help. You sold my house. We thought you would understand. I could feel years of motherhood fighting inside me. Part of me wanted to hold him. Part of me wanted to protect him. Because when your child suffers, some part of you always suffers too. But another part of me finally understood something painful. My son had stopped seeing me as his mother. He had started seeing me as an asset. The room had become unbearable. I picked up my purse. Inside it rested David's fountain pen. For some reason, I touched it, as if he were beside me, as if he were saying exactly what he had said years earlier. Never sign anything under pressure. I looked at Brian. You should have come to me. We were ashamed. You should have trusted me. We needed the money. You needed my permission. Tears filled his eyes. For the first time all morning, he looked like the little boy I once knew. But little boys do not secretly sell their mother's home. Daniel stood. Mrs. Murphy, if you'd like, I can arrange copies of all the documents involved. I nodded. Yes. Brian immediately looked frightened. Mom. Yes. Karen spoke quietly. Helen, please, don't do this. I looked directly at her. Don't do what make this worse. Worse. Again that word. As if I had created the disaster. As if I had walked into a bank and sold my own house. I put on my coat. The Hendersons slowly stood as well. Mrs. Henderson approached me. I truly am sorry. So am I. She squeezed my hand. I hope you keep your home. I almost cried because a stranger had shown me more kindness than my own family. As I walked toward the door, Emily suddenly ran after me. Grandma. I turned. She was crying uncontrollably. I didn't want this. Then why didn't you tell me? Her voice broke. Dad said you would hate us. I looked at my granddaughter. And for the first time, I realized that everyone in that room had been living inside Brian's fear. Fear of debt, fear of failure, fear of losing everything. But nobody had considered what they were asking me to lose. My home, my memories, my dignity. I gently touched Emily's face. You should have trusted me. She sobbed. I know. Then I walked out of the bank. The snow had started falling again. Margaret waited in the car. She saw my face. What happened? I looked back at the building. Inside sat my son, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter. A broken family. And somewhere inside those files lay documents carrying my name. Documents I had never signed. For the first time since David died, I understood something he had tried to teach me years ago. Sometimes the people who hurt you are not strangers. Sometimes they are the people who convince themselves that your life belongs to them. And I had a feeling that the truth about my family was only beginning to emerge. The drive home from the bank felt longer than any drive I had ever taken. Snow continued falling across Columbus, covering the streets in white. Margaret drove quietly, keeping both hands on the steering wheel while I stared through the passenger window. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, she asked softly, "Are you all right?" I surprised myself by laughing. No. The word felt honest. For weeks, I had been confused. For months, I had been suspicious. Now I knew the truth. My family had not merely discussed my house. They had shown it, listed it, accepted an offer, scheduled a closing. And somewhere inside the bank sat documents carrying my name. My name. A name I had not written. Margaret pulled into my driveway. The house stood exactly as I had left it that morning. The porch, the windows, the maple tree, everything looked the same. Yet I no longer felt the same. As I opened the front door, the silence inside the house seemed heavier than before. I removed my coat, set my purse on the table, and suddenly began crying. Not because of the house, not because of the money, because I had spent 45 years believing my son would always protect me. Instead, I had walked into a bank and discovered that he had built an entire plan around taking the one thing his father and I had created together. Margaret stayed with me until evening. She made tea. She listened, and finally, before leaving, she said something important. You need answers. I know. You also need someone on your side. That night, I called Robert Jenkins. Robert had been David's closest friend for almost 30 years. He was 68 years old and had practiced law most of his adult life. After David died, he attended the funeral and occasionally checked on me, but we had not spoken much recently. He answered immediately. Helen. Hello, Robert? His voice softened. How are you? I looked around the kitchen. Not very well. An hour later, he sat at my dining table. I placed every document in front of him. The page from Brian's dinner, the copied forms, the notes, the bank information. Robert read quietly. The room remained silent except for the ticking clock. Finally, he removed his glasses. Helen. Yes. Did you sign any of these? No. None. None. He nodded slowly. That is good. Good. Yes. I felt confused. Robert, my son, tried to sell my house and failed. The words surprised me. Failed? He leaned back. Your signature is required, but there are papers. There are always papers. But my name appears. That doesn't transfer ownership. I looked down. Then why do I feel like I've already lost everything? Robert's expression softened. Because this isn't about the house, I looked at him. It's about trust. The words hit me immediately. Trust. Exactly. My family had broken something larger than property. They had broken trust. Robert returned to the documents. Then his expression changed. What is this? He pulled out one particular form. I recognized it immediately. The acknowledgement form Daniel had shown me. My printed name appeared above a signature, not mine. Robert studied it carefully. This concerns me. Why? Because someone represented that you received these disclosures. My stomach tightened. Is that illegal? He answered carefully. It depends on who signed them and why. For the first time that day, genuine fear entered me. Because until then, I had believed Brian had simply made terrible decisions. But what if it was more than that? What if lines had been crossed? Robert gathered the documents. I'd like copies. Of course. He hesitated. Have you spoken to Brian? Number Karen? Number Emily? No? He nodded. Good. I frowned. Good. Everyone needs time to think. The next morning, my telephone rang at 8. It was Daniel Carter. Mrs. Murphy. Yes, I wanted to update you. His voice sounded very different from before, much more serious. What happened? The bank reviewed the file. I sat down. And there are some inconsistencies. My heart began beating faster. What kind? He chose his words carefully. Certain signatures and acknowledgments require clarification. I thought about Robert, the false signature, the forms, the paperwork. Are you saying someone signed my name? I can't make that determination? But there are questions. Questions. That word felt dangerous. Daniel continued. The transaction is suspended. Completely? Yes. Relief washed over me. My home was safe, at least for now. But Daniel was not finished. The buyers have requested additional information. The Hendersons. Yes, they were very upset. I understand. He paused. Mrs. Murphy, I sincerely apologize for what I assumed you had approved everything. I closed my eyes. So did everyone else. After the call ended, I walked through the house. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to touch things again. David's chair, the staircase railing, the family photographs, the kitchen table. Still mine, still here. Around noon, Brian arrived. I saw his truck through the window. For several minutes, I considered not answering. Instead, I opened the door. He looked exhausted. His eyes were red. Can I come in? I stepped aside. Neither of us spoke as he entered the living room. Finally, he said, The bank called. I know. They suspended everything. Yes. He sat down heavily. I didn't want this. I looked at him. What did you want? He stared at the floor. I wanted help. Living room. Finally, he said, The bank called. I know. They suspended everything. Yes. He sat down heavily. I didn't want this. I looked at him. What did you want? He stared at the floor. I wanted help. Then you ask. I was ashamed. You should have been. The words hurt both of us. He looked older, smaller, almost like the frightened boy who once came home after breaking a neighbor's window. But this was not a baseball. This was my life. Karen is terrified. Of what? Almost like the frightened boy who once came home after breaking a neighbor's window. But this was not a baseball. This was my life. Karen is terrified. Of what? The paperwork. I sat down opposite him. What paperwork, Brian? His hands trembled. There were forms. Who signed them? He looked away. Karen knew someone. My heart sank. What does that mean? A notary. Silence. Cold silence. A notary. She said it was only preliminary. Did someone sign my name? He began crying. Actual tears. I never wanted this. That wasn't my question. He covered his face. It got out of control. Those words terrified me, because problems do not get out of control by themselves. People make choices. One choice, then another, then another, until suddenly they are sitting inside a bank trying to sell their mother's house. I spoke quietly. Brian, look at me. He lifted his eyes. Did Karen arrange those signatures? He said nothing. His silence answered me. The room suddenly felt very cold, because for the first time I realized something even worse. This had not been desperation. This had been planning. And somewhere inside that plan existed people, documents, and decisions I still knew nothing about. As Brian sat crying in my living room, I looked toward David's photograph on the bookshelf. My husband had once said that money reveals character. Perhaps he had been right, because the bank had started asking questions. The paperwork had started falling apart. And I had the terrible feeling that the truth hidden inside those documents would hurt far more than the attempted sale itself. I did not sleep that night. Brian's words repeated themselves inside my head. Karen knew someone, a notary. It got out of control. Those sentences felt far more frightening than the bank meeting itself. Up until then, I had believed my family had simply made terrible decisions out of desperation. Now, I was beginning to understand that certain decisions had been made deliberately. The following morning, Robert Jenkins arrived at my house carrying a leather briefcase. He placed several folders on my dining room table. Helen, he said gently, I found something. I sat down. What? He removed an old envelope. I immediately recognized David's handwriting. My heart stopped. The envelope had my name written across the front. For Helen. Only if necessary. I looked up. What is this? I immediately recognized David's handwriting. My heart stopped. The envelope had my name written across the front. For Helen. Only if necessary. I looked up. What is this? Robert removed his glasses. Your husband left instructions. I could barely speak. Instructions. He nodded. After David became ill, he reviewed all of his legal documents. He was very concerned about your future. Tears immediately filled my eyes. Even 6 years after his death, hearing David's name spoken aloud still hurt. Robert carefully opened the envelope. Inside were several documents. The first was a trust agreement. The second was a property protection clause. The third was a handwritten letter. I stared at them. What is all this? Robert folded his hands. David placed the house into a family trust before he died. I looked at him. A trust? Yes. Why didn't he tell me? He did. I frowned. No, Robert smiled sadly. He said you would forget because you were focused on his illness. I tried to remember. Hospital rooms, doctors, chemotherapy, fear. Perhaps he had. Perhaps I simply could not hear anything except that I was losing him. Robert opened the legal documents. The trust names you as sole lifetime beneficiary. What does that mean? It means the property cannot be transferred, sold, or reassigned without your direct authorization. I felt my breathing slow. And Brian, he has no ownership rights. Karen, none. Anyone. Robert shook his head. No one. Relief washed through me. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe. David had protected me, even after death, even after 6 years, even now. Robert continued reading. There's another provision. What if questions ever arise concerning pressure, influence, or competency? The property remains fully protected until your independent legal approval. I looked at him. You mean David expected this? Robert became quiet. I don't know if he expected this specifically. Then why? He hesitated. Because he understood people. I thought about David. He had always been careful, always practical, always thinking 10 years ahead. Sometimes I used to tease him. You plan for everything. He would smile. Not everything, just the things that matter. And apparently, I mattered. Robert handed me the handwritten letter. My fingers trembled. The date showed 6 weeks before David died. I unfolded the paper. My dearest Helen, if you're reading this, then life probably became more complicated than either of us hoped. First, remember something important. This house belongs to you. Not because of papers, not because of money, because you built it. You gave it life. You filled it with family. You made it a home. Never let anyone convince you that age makes your choices less important. Never sign anything because someone makes you feel guilty. And never believe that being alone means being weak. You are stronger than you know. I love you. David. I could not stop crying. Robert quietly handed me a tissue. He loved you very much. I nodded. Yes. He trusted you. That sentence stayed with me. Because lately everyone seemed to question my judgment. My son, my daughter-in-law, even my granddaughter. But David had trusted me, completely. That afternoon, my telephone rang. Emily. For several seconds, I stared at her name. Then I answered. Hello? Her voice sounded small. Grandma? Yes. Can I come over? I hesitated. Why I need to talk to you. 2 hours later, she sat across from me at the kitchen table. She looked exhausted, young, broken. Not the confident college graduate. Not the granddaughter who had told me I needed less space. Just a frightened girl. She began crying almost immediately. I'm sorry. I remained silent. I didn't know what to do. You could have told me. She nodded. I know. I poured her tea. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, Dad was scared. Of what? Everything. She explained that Brian's debts had grown rapidly. Several investments failed, credit cards accumulated, loans increased. Karen's small real estate consulting business lost money. Arguments became constant. Bills piled up. The house, my house, eventually entered every conversation. Emily looked down. They kept saying it was the only solution. The only solution for whom? She began crying again. All of us. I looked at my granddaughter. You knew I didn't want to move. Eventually entered every conversation. Emily looked down. They kept saying it was the only solution. The only solution for whom? She began crying again. All of us. I looked at my granddaughter. You knew I didn't want to move. Yes, you knew I loved this house. Yes. Then why? Her answer broke my heart. Dad said you would understand eventually. Eventually, the same word. Everyone had been waiting for eventually. Eventually, she would agree. Eventually, she would move. Eventually, she would understand. Eventually, she would disappear. I reached across the table. Emily. She looked up. Did your father ever ask me? No. Did your mother? No. Why? She whispered. They were afraid. Of me? No. Then what? She looked directly into my eyes. They were afraid you would say no. The truth sat between us. Not concern, not protection, not love, fear. Because they already knew my answer. No. Emily wiped her eyes. Grandma, there was something else. My heart tightened. What? She looked down. There was a dinner. What dinner? Dad met the buyers. The Hendersons. She nodded. When? Almost 2 months ago. 2 months. Before the bank. Before the paperwork. Before the arguments. They had already found buyers. I felt cold. They showed them the house. My voice barely worked. When one Saturday, when you visited Aunt Carol, I remembered. I had spent the afternoon at my sister's house. My own son had brought strangers into my home, without telling me, without asking. Emily continued. Mom said everything would be okay if you signed. I closed my eyes. The entire timeline suddenly became clear. The photographs, the sign, the paperwork, the buyers, the closing, the signatures. Everything had been moving forward long before I knew anything. When Emily finally left the house, became quiet again, I walked into David's office. The letter remained on his desk. I read it once more. Never let anyone convince you that age makes your choices less important. For weeks, everyone had spoken to me as though I were disappearing, as though 67 meant incapable, as though my future belonged to others. But David had known me. Robert believed me. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I finally understood something. The house had never been the real issue. The real issue was whether I still had the right to decide my own life. And thanks to my husband, I still did. The next few days passed quietly. Too quietly. For the first time in months, nobody called me asking about documents. Nobody mentioned the house. Nobody spoke about my future. Yet the silence itself felt heavy. On Sunday morning, I attended church alone. Many people approached me after the service. Some offered hugs. Some asked whether I was feeling well. Others avoided eye contact completely. As I walked toward my car, Mrs. Donnelly stopped me. Helen. Yes, I wanted to apologize for what I told people your house was being sold. I smiled sadly. You only repeated what you heard. She lowered her voice. People have been talking. My stomach tightened. What people? The neighborhood. I suddenly realized something I had not considered. The real estate sign. The buyers. The visits. The conversations. People knew. Perhaps not everything, but enough. I had become the elderly widow whose family was moving her out. Without my knowledge. Without my permission. The humiliation hurt more than I expected. That afternoon, I sat in David's workshop. His tools remained exactly where he had left them. I picked up one of his old measuring tapes. 42 years. How quickly people had reduced 42 years into square footage and market value. The telephone rang. Karen. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. Helen. Her voice sounded exhausted. We need to talk. There isn't much left to discuss. Please. I remained silent. Finally, I agreed. She arrived alone. For the first time in years, Karen looked older than her age. Her makeup was gone. Her eyes were swollen. She sat at my kitchen table without speaking. After several minutes, she whispered, Brian left. I looked at her. What do you mean? He's staying with his friend Michael. The news surprised me. Why, he blames me. I said nothing. Karen wiped her eyes. He says I pushed too hard. Did you? She laughed bitterly. Yes. The honesty shocked me. For months, she had defended every decision. Now she looked defeated. I thought I was helping. Helping whom? Our family. I folded my hands. By selling my home. She lowered her head. We lost almost everything. Why didn't you tell me? She looked up. Because I was ashamed. The same word Brian had used. Ashamed. Perhaps shame had become the foundation of every lie. Karen continued. The business failed. How badly? We borrowed against everything. I remembered the $200,000, the debts, the investments, the pressure. You thought my house would save you. Tears rolled down her face. Yes, I appreciated her honesty. But honesty after betrayal feels very different because the damage already exists. She looked around this kitchen. You and David built something beautiful here. I remained silent. We never had what you had. For the first time, I saw Karen differently, not simply as the woman who wanted my house, but as a woman who had spent years chasing success, money, status, security, and somewhere along the way she had convinced herself that my home was the answer. I loved your son, she whispered. Do you still? She looked away. I don't know. The answer made me sad, because suddenly I realized this was no longer only about my house. The entire family was collapsing. Karen eventually stood. I don't expect forgiveness. I nodded. Good. She looked surprised. Because I can't give it yet. Her eyes filled again. I understand. Before leaving, she stopped near the front door. There is something you should know. My heart tightened. What? The signatures. The room became quiet. I didn't sign them. Who did? She swallowed. My brother. I stared at her. Your brother. He's a notary. The blood drained from my face. He signed my name. He said it wasn't final paperwork. I could barely breathe. He signed my name. Karen began crying again. We thought you'd sign eventually. Eventually. Always eventually. As though my consent could simply be borrowed until later. She left shortly afterward, and for nearly an hour I sat alone in my kitchen. Not angry, not crying, simply tired. That evening Robert called. Helen. Yes, I received copies from the bank. My stomach tightened. And the signature issue is more serious than we thought. I closed my eyes. How serious? There are several documents. Yes. I felt cold. Robert, are you telling me someone signed my name more than once? Yes. The silence between us lasted several seconds. He spoke carefully. I think you need to prepare yourself. For what? Your family may be facing consequences. Consequences. The word frightened me, because despite everything, Brian was still my son. Emily was still my granddaughter. And somewhere beneath all the anger, I still loved them. After the call, I walked upstairs. I opened the bedroom closet. David's coat still hung exactly where he had left it. I touched the sleeve. I don't know what to do. Of course, there was no answer. Only silence. But then I remembered his letter. Never let anyone convince you that being alone means being weak. I sat on the edge of the bed. For months, everyone had treated me as though I needed saving, as though I was fragile, as though my age had made me incapable. Yet somehow, I was the one still standing. My marriage had survived. My home still stood. My finances remained secure. The people who tried to rescue me had destroyed their own lives. The next morning, Brian appeared at my front door. He looked worse than before, unshaven, exhausted, broken. Mom. I opened the door. What do you want? He looked down. The police called. My heart stopped. The police? He nodded. The bank filed a report. The room suddenly felt cold. About the signatures. I stared at him. What happens now? Tears filled his eyes. I don't know. For the first time since all of this began, I saw genuine fear. Not fear of debt, not fear of losing money, fear of consequences. And standing there in my doorway, my son finally looked less like the man who tried to sell my house, and more like a frightened little boy who had wandered too far into darkness and no longer knew how to come home. 3 days after Brian stood trembling on my front porch, I made a decision. For weeks, everyone else had held conversations without me. My son had made plans. Karen had arranged paperwork. Emily had remained silent. Strangers had walked through my house. Buyers had signed contracts. The bank had scheduled a closing. Everyone had spoken. Except me. That was about to change. I called me. That was about to change. I called Robert Jenkins. I want them all here. He understood immediately. When Saturday afternoon, I'll come. Next, I called Margaret. Would you sit with me? Of course. Robert Jenkins. I want them all here. He understood immediately. When Saturday afternoon, I'll come. Next, I called Margaret. Would you sit with me? Of course. Finally, I called Brian. He answered quietly. Mom, I want all of you here Saturday. Silence. Why, because this ends now. Mom, Brian, bring Karen. He hesitated. And Emily? Yes. What is this? I looked around the living room. David's chair, the fireplace, the family photographs. My house, I said. My rules. Saturday arrived gray and cold. By noon, I had cleaned the entire house. Not because it needed cleaning, because I needed strength. The dining room table was set. Coffee, tea, water. No dinner, no desserts. No attempt to pretend we were a normal family. At 1 o'clock, Robert arrived. At 1:15, Margaret came. At exactly 1:30, Brian's truck pulled into the driveway. Karen sat beside him. Emily sat in the back. Nobody smiled. Nobody hugged. For several moments, they simply stood in my living room. I remained standing. Robert sat quietly near the fireplace. Margaret occupied David's old chair. The symbolism was not accidental. I finally spoke. "Please sit." Nobody argued. The silence felt enormous. Brian looked exhausted. Karen seemed frightened. Emily appeared ready to cry. I folded my hands. For months, everyone in this room has had conversations about my life. Nobody answered. "You discussed my future." Silence. "You discussed my home." Silence. "You discussed my money." Brian lowered his eyes. "You found buyers." Karen began crying. "You showed strangers my house." Emily wiped her eyes. And nobody asked me. The room remained still. I looked directly at Brian. "When did it begin?" He swallowed. "About a year ago." "Why?" His voice trembled. "The debt." "How much?" "Almost $240,000. Margaret gasped quietly. Robert remained silent. I looked at Karen. "And you?" She whispered. "My business lost everything." I nodded. Then I asked the question I had carried for weeks. "When did my house become your solution?" Nobody answered. Finally, Karen said, "When we realized we couldn't save ourselves. The honesty hurt, but lies hurt more." Robert opened his briefcase. He removed several documents: the trust, the property agreement, David's instructions. Brian stared at them. "What are those?" Robert answered. "Your father's legal documents." Brian looked confused. "What documents?" I spoke quietly. "Your father protected this house." Karen looked toward me. "What do you mean?" Robert explained. "The property belongs entirely to Helen Murphy during her lifetime." Brian looked shocked. "You mean—" "Yes," Robert said. "No one has ownership rights." Emily looked at me. "Grandpa did that?" "Yes." I reached for David's letter. The room became very quiet. "I want all of you to hear something." My voice trembled as I began reading. "Never let anyone convince you that age makes your choices less important." Emily began crying. Brian covered his face. I continued, "Never sign anything because someone makes you feel guilty." Karen lowered her head. "You are stronger than you know." When I finished, nobody spoke. Because David had entered the room. Not physically, but through his words. And suddenly, everyone understood. This was never simply a house. This was his promise to me. I looked directly at Brian. "Did you sign my name?" He began crying. "No. Who did—" He looked toward Karen. Karen closed her eyes. "My brother." The room became silent. Margaret looked horrified. Emily whispered, "Mom." Karen wiped her tears. "He said it wasn't permanent." Robert spoke carefully. "Forgery is permanent." Nobody answered. Brian suddenly stood. "I didn't know." Karen looked up. "You knew enough?" "No." "Yes." Their marriage began collapsing right there in my living room. Brian pointed toward her. "You said it was legal. You wanted the money. You pushed me. You agreed." Their voices rose. Years of fear, debt, shame, failure. Everything exploded. Emily suddenly stood. "Stop." The room became silent. She looked at both parents. "I heard you." Brian froze. Karen stared at her. Emily's voice shook. "I heard every conversation." Tears ran down her face. "You said Grandma would sign because she always gives us everything. I felt my heart break. Brian lowered his eyes. Karen began crying again. Emily looked at me. I should have told you. I nodded slowly. Yes. I was scared. Of what? She looked at her father, losing our family. I almost cried, because that was exactly what everyone had been trying to prevent, and exactly what had happened. I stood and walked toward the fireplace. Above it hung a photograph of David and me on our 40th anniversary. I looked at my family. I spent my entire life giving. Nobody moved. I helped raise Emily. Emily cried harder. I loaned money. Brian looked down. I opened my home. Karen wiped her eyes. And when you needed help, you decided to take the one thing your father left me. Brian finally spoke. Mom, I'm sorry. I looked at him. For what? He could barely answer. For all of it. Karen whispered, I'm sorry. Emily said, Grandma, I'm sorry. The room became quiet again. I walked back to the table. Robert looked at me. This moment belonged to me. Only me. I looked at my son. For now, I need distance. His face fell. I looked at Karen. You are no longer welcome to make decisions about my life. She nodded through tears. I looked at Emily. You still have time to become the woman I know you can be. She began sobbing. Finally, I looked around the house, the walls, the photographs, the years. This home is not for sale. Nobody argued. It never was. Outside, snow had begun falling again. Inside, something had finally ended. The lies, the pretending, the excuses. For the first time since the bank, everyone sat together inside my living room without secrets. And although the pain remained, something else had entered the room. Truth. Because sometimes families do not begin healing when people apologize. Sometimes they begin healing when someone finally says, no more. Winter slowly began to loosen its grip on Columbus. The snow melted from the sidewalks. The maple tree outside my window started showing small buds. For the first time in months, I could sit on my front porch again. Yet inside, our family winter remained. Brian rarely called. Karen moved into a small apartment across town. Emily stayed with friends for several weeks. Everything that had once seemed permanent had fallen apart. And somehow, despite being the woman everyone believed needed rescuing, I had become the only person still standing inside the original home. One afternoon, Robert called. The investigation is finished. My hands immediately became cold. What happened? The authorities reviewed the documents. I sat down, and there won't be criminal charges. I released a breath I didn't realize I was holding. But Robert continued. The notary lost his license. Karen's brother. The man who signed my name. The man I had never even met. He admitted what happened. I closed my eyes. Why? He said he believed you would eventually approve the sale. Eventually. Always eventually. The future everyone created for me. Without me. Robert's voice softened. Brian cooperated. What does that mean? He provided information. And Karen. She did as well. I thanked him and ended the call. For several minutes, I sat quietly in the kitchen. No criminal charges, no court, no police. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt strangely empty. because consequences had arrived anyway. Brian had lost his marriage. Karen had lost her business. Emily had lost her trust in her parents, and I had lost my confidence in the people I loved. A week later, Brian called. "Mom, yes, can we meet?" I remained silent. "Please." I finally agreed. Not at my house. Not yet. We met at a small coffee shop downtown, the same coffee shop where David and I used to stop after church. Brian arrived early. He looked thinner, older. His hair had turned noticeably gray. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, "I filed for bankruptcy." I looked at him. "I'm sorry." "I deserve it. No one deserves everything." He stared at his coffee. "I lost Karen." I said nothing. "I almost lost Emily." His voice broke. "And I almost lost you." The words hurt because they were true. He looked up. They were true." He looked up. "I don't know how I became this person." I thought about that. Debt, fear, shame, desperation. Sometimes people do not become different people. Sometimes fear simply removes the masks. You stopped asking how I became this person. I thought about that. Debt, fear, shame, desperation. Sometimes people do not become different people. Sometimes fear simply removes the masks. You stopped asking, I said quietly. He frowned. What? You stopped asking me for help. He looked confused. You decided for me. Tears filled his eyes. I know. You treated me like I was already gone. His shoulders collapsed. I thought I was protecting everyone except me. Yes, the honesty mattered. For the first time in many months, he wasn't explaining. He wasn't defending. He wasn't blaming Karen. He wasn't talking about debt. He was simply telling the truth. We sat quietly. Finally, he reached into his pocket. He placed a key on the table. My house key. The spare key I had given him 20 years earlier. I shouldn't have had this. I stared at the key. Memories flooded back. Giving him the key after Emily was born. Telling him he was always welcome. Trust. Love. Family. He pushed it toward me. You decide if I ever earn it again. My eyes filled with tears. Because that little piece of metal represented far more than a key. It represented trust. And trust, once broken, does not return quickly. Several days later, Emily came to see me. This time, she brought a cardboard box. What's this? She smiled weakly. I found Grandpa's things. Inside were old photographs, letters, Christmas ornaments, David's fishing hat. Emily sat beside me on the floor. For hours we looked through memories. She laughed at old pictures. She cried over others. Finally, she asked, Will you ever forgive, Dad? I looked at David's photograph. I already have. She looked surprised. Really? Yes. Then why are things still broken? I smiled sadly. Forgiveness and trust are different things. She thought about that. Can trust come back? I looked out the window. The first flowers had begun appearing near the porch. Yes. How? Slowly, Emily nodded. For the first time in months, we sat together like grandmother and granddaughter again. No secrets, no lies, only honesty. That evening, I walked through my house. The living room, the kitchen, David's office, the workshop. Every room carried memories. For months, I had been fighting to save the house. But now, I understood something. The house had also saved me. Because it forced me to stand up, to speak, to say no, to remember that age does not erase authority, that being widowed does not mean becoming invisible, that love does not require surrender. Several days later, a moving truck appeared next door. The Hendersons, the couple who almost bought my home. Coincidentally, another house on our street had become available. Mrs. Henderson walked across the lawn. She smiled. "Looks like we're neighbors after all." I laughed. "Apparently." She looked at my house. "You kept it." "Yes." "Good." Her words warmed me, because even strangers understood what my family had forgotten. Some houses are not simply property, they are entire lives. That night, I sat on the front porch. The air felt warmer. The sky had turned orange. I held David's letter in my hands. Never let anyone convince you that age makes your choices less important. For months, everyone had spoken as though my life belonged to them. Now I finally understood. My future still belonged to me. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I could finally imagine something beyond betrayal. Not forgetting, not pretending, but healing, slowly. One honest step at a time. Summer arrived quietly that year. The maple tree outside my front porch was full again. The flower beds David and I had planted decades earlier bloomed with colors I had almost forgotten. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed, because I had. Nearly 8 months had passed since the day I walked into First National Bank and discovered that my family had tried to sell my home. 8 months since I sat in that conference room. 8 months since Daniel Carter asked for my signature. The signature everyone thought they already had. Life had become calmer. Not perfect, but calmer. Brian rented a small apartment on the other side of town. He found a second job managing inventory for a hardware company. Karen's divorce became final in early June. She moved closer to her sister and began working for another real estate office. Emily finished college. She started teaching at an elementary school only 20 minutes away. And I remained exactly where David wanted me to be, at home. One Saturday morning, Brian called. "Mom." "Yes." "Could I come over?" For a moment, I looked at the spare key lying inside my kitchen drawer. The key he had returned months earlier. "No," I said. Silence. Then I added, "But you can visit." An hour later, he arrived carrying paint cans. I thought the porch could use some work. I looked outside. The white railing had begun peeling. David normally painted it every spring. The sight still hurt me. "I can do it." Brian shook his head. "I know." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, "Dad always hated peeling paint." I smiled. Yes, he did. For the first time in years, my son and I worked together. No arguments, no discussions about money, no paperwork, no future plans. Only paint, only silence. Only two people trying to rebuild something neither one fully understood. Around noon, Emily arrived carrying lunch. A few minutes later, Karen unexpectedly appeared. Everyone became uncomfortable. She stood beside her car. "I can leave." I looked at her. She looked smaller now. Not weaker. Simply humbled. "Stay," I said. For the first time in many months, my entire family sat together on my porch. Nobody discussed the house. Nobody discussed debt. Nobody discussed the bank. Instead, Emily talked about her students. Brian spoke about work. Karen mentioned an apartment she had decorated herself. Small conversations, normal conversations, human conversations. At one point, Emily walked into the living room and returned holding David's old photograph. "Can we put this outside?" She placed it on the table. For a few moments, everyone looked at him. Brian finally spoke. Dad would be disappointed. Nobody answered. Because we all knew it was true. Karen wiped her eyes. "I think he would also want us to fix this." Brian stared at his hands. "I don't know how." I looked at my son. "Neither do I." The honesty surprised him. Because healing is not a single moment. There is no speech, no apology, no magic sentence. Only time, only effort, only truth. Later that afternoon, Brian walked with me into David's workshop. Nothing had changed. The tools remained on the walls. The fishing poles stood in the corner. Dust covered the workbench. Brian looked around quietly. "I haven't been in here since the funeral." "I know." He touched one of David's hammers. "I failed him." I looked at my son. "No," he seemed surprised. "I failed you." "Yes." His eyes filled with tears. "I don't know why you still talk to me." I thought carefully before answering. "Because you're my son." He cried openly. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, "I never wanted the house." I looked at him. "I believe you. I wanted the problems to disappear." I nodded, and I became one of them. The truth had finally arrived. Not greed, not evil. Fear, shame, desperation, and terrible decisions. When evening came, everyone prepared to leave. Karen approached me near the front door. "I don't expect forgiveness." I smiled gently. "You've said that before." She looked down. "I mean it this time." I touched her hand. "I know." Emily hugged me tightly. "I love you, Grandma." "I love you too." Brian stood beside his truck. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into his pocket. The key. My old house key. He placed it in my hand. "You still decide." I looked at it. The small piece of metal that had once represented trust. Months ago, I had told him he would have to earn it. Today, I realized something. Trust does not return because someone deserves it. Trust returns because both people decide to build it again. I placed the key back into his hand. His eyes widened. "Mom, you don't own this house." Tears filled his eyes. "I know. But you're my son." He could not speak. "If you ever walk through that door again, you knock first." He laughed through tears. "I will. And if you ever need help," his face broke, "ask." He nodded. "I promise." That night after everyone left, I sat alone on the porch. The summer air felt warm. Crickets sang in the distance. The porch railing had fresh paint. David's photograph sat beside me. I took out his letter. The paper had become worn from reading. "You are stronger than you know." I finally understood. Strength is not refusing to love. Strength is loving while protecting yourself. Strength is saying no. Strength is surviving betrayal without becoming bitter. Strength is remaining visible in a world that often asks older women to quietly disappear. My family once believed this house was the answer to their problems, but the real answer had been here all along. Honesty, respect, permission, love. As darkness settled over the yard, I looked at the house one final time. The windows glowed softly. The flowers moved in the breeze. The maple tree stood tall. And for the first time since David died, I no longer felt alone. Because this house had never been simply wood and walls. It was memory. It was dignity. It was love. And most importantly, it was still mine.